Have you ever felt like you completely defied a stereotype?
Right, like a label that just didn't fit.
Exactly. Or maybe you've been handed a label at some point in your life by a teacher, a boss, a partner, or even a medical professional, and you just sat there looking at it thinking, this doesn't actually fit the reality of my daily life at
It's a
all.
very common experience,
I
yeah.
want you to really think about that for a second. We all have these predefined boxes that society tries to neatly pack us into, mostly for its own convenience, I mean. But what happens when the edges of your life, your actual day-to-day lived experience, inevitably spill over the sides of that box?
That's where things get complicated.
They really do. So today, we are going on a specific mission. We're going to completely challenge our preconceived notions about neurological labels. We're going to take a microscope to the gap between rigid clinical stereotypes and the actual complicated, highly nuanced reality of lived experience.
Which is so needed right now.
It is. And to do this, we are diving into a brief but incredibly powerful piece of writing by Tomomi Harada. It was published on Lateliko Hitatsu Navi. And I mean, even the title of the article is a journey in itself. It's called ADHD Diagnosis in My 50s. I can tidy up and I can read the room, realizing the diversity of traits after diagnosis.
It is a striking title.
Hmm.
And what makes this particular source material so vital for our deep dive today is how immediately it forces us to reconsider what symptoms actually look like in our everyday lives.
Yeah, because we have such a fixed idea, right?
Right. When we hear medical or psychological labels, our brains instantly conjure up a very specific, usually very extreme set of behaviors. We rely on those mental shortcuts because evaluating human complexity takes a lot of cognitive effort.
It's exhausting to evaluate everyone on a case-by-case basis.
Exactly. But Tomomi's personal account, as brief as it is, serves as a massive stop sign for those automatic assumptions. It establishes a calm, analytical challenge to you, the listener. It asks, when you look at someone, are you evaluating the label they carry, or are you actually evaluating the person in front of you?
That's the core question. Okay, let's unpack this because we really need to start with the very first and perhaps most conceptually jarring detail in her account. She mentions right out of the get that she was diagnosed in her 50s.
50 years old, yes.
Not in elementary school, not struggling through college. She lived half a century before this label entered her life. And for an audience that understands the basics of neurodivergence, we instantly recognize that a late-in-life diagnosis completely rewrites the standard narrative.
It absolutely does. And the profound implications of that timeline really cannot be overstated. A late-in-life diagnosis isn't just a medical update. It's an autobiographical rewrite.
An autobiographical rewrite. I like that.
Yeah, because you suddenly have to look back at 5 decades of your life. 5 decades of what you might have internalized as personal failures, character flaws, or just inexplicable exhaustion. And you have to recategorize them as unsupported symptoms.
Which is a massive paradigm shift.
Think about the sheer volume of life that happens in 50 years. You navigate the entirety of your formal education, which is heavily structured and rigid. You enter the workforce, adapting to various corporate or professional cultures.
Right, and build friendships, navigate the incredibly complex nuances of romantic relationships, manage finances.
Exactly. You deal with all the societal expectations of adulthood. And she did all of this while operating with a neurological framework that is fundamentally different from the statistical majority of people around her. But crucially, without having the vocabulary to explain why her friction with the world felt different.
Right, but I want to push back on that slightly, or at least play devil's advocate for a moment. If she navigated all of that school, career, relationships for 50 years, doesn't that imply the friction wasn't actually that bad?
That's what people often assume.
Yeah, society tends to look at highly functional people who get diagnosed late and think, well, you made it this far, how much could you really be struggling? It's like playing a complex video game for 50 years on hard mode without realizing there was a settings menu.
That's a great way to put it.
You see other players breezing through and you internalize the struggle thinking you just lack skill. But if you're still beating the levels, people question if you're truly disadvantaged.
That is a very common societal pushback. And your video game analogy perfectly highlights the flaw in that thinking. Yes, she was beating the levels, but at what internal cost? The fact that she reached her 50s without a diagnosis doesn't mean the condition was mild. It implies she developed highly sophisticated, incredibly taxing coping mechanisms.
She masked.
She masked.
Yeah.
Being diagnosed in her 50s instantly tells us we aren't looking at a standard, externalized presentation. We're looking at half a century of high-level masking. She adapted and found workarounds that likely required twice the cognitive energy of a neurotypical person performing the exact same tasks.
Yeah. So she was just running her engine at redline the whole time.
Precisely. Her surprise at the diagnosis intrinsically challenges the idea that neurological differences are easily spotted. If we assume these conditions are universally debilitating in obvious ways, we completely erase the reality of human adaptation.
That reframes it entirely. It's the difference between looking at the output versus looking at the engine working to produce that output. The output looked fine, so society assumed the engine was standard.
And we have to consider the medical context of those 50 years, too. She grew up in an era where the diagnostic criteria were vastly different. The medical community's understanding was largely skewed toward highly visible external presentations.
Right, like the hyperactive presentation in young boys.
Exactly. The quiet, internalized presentations or the intense internal hyperactivity that many women experience were systematically overlooked. The diagnostic lens was simply too narrow to capture her reality, which forced her to carry the weight of that unacknowledged difference entirely on her own shoulders.
Which means the system failed to see her simply because she didn't fit the caricature. I want you, the listener, to pause and genuinely reflect on your own assumptions here. When you hear that someone has this specific diagnosis, do you immediately picture a woman in her 50s who has successfully navigated half a century of adult responsibilities?
Most people don't.
No, they don't. And if you don't, why is that? We have to question where our mental image of this condition came from. Because Tomomi's lived experience proves that the image we are culturally sold and the reality of the condition are completely mismatched.
That mismatch between what we're culturally trained to see and what she actually experiences is exactly why Tomomi targets the big three symptoms next in her piece.
Right.
She outlines the standard clinical view, pointing out that people with her condition are defined by three main symptoms: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. These are the foundational pillars of the diagnostic manual.
The core criteria.
Yes. But what she does so effectively is highlight how these clinical medical terms are translated by the general public into everyday assumptions. She notes that because of these three specific symptoms, society assumes there is a mandatory list of things people are bad at.
And right at the top of that list is the most pervasive stereotype of them all. The assumption that she must inherently struggle with tidying up and organizing. The mandatory messy room.
Visual proof of the diagnosis, according to society.
Right. But before we get to the messy room, I want to interrogate those big three terms. In a clinical setting, inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity are descriptors of how a brain processes dopamine and regulates attention. But out in the wild, in our everyday society, those words don't sound like medical terms anymore.
They sound like character judgments.
Exactly. They sound like moral judgments. They sound like character flaws.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see exactly how medical definitions get reduced to behavioral caricatures. Let's unpack the mechanisms behind this. Why does a complex neurodevelopmental condition get boiled down to a messy room?
Because it's easy to see.
Right. Because human beings crave simplicity, and we evaluate others based on visible output. Concepts like executive dysfunction or dopamine dysregulation are complex. To really understand them requires an understanding of how the brain prioritizes tasks, initiates action, and sustains effort without immediate reward.
Right. Let's pause on that for the listener, because we shouldn't just throw around executive dysfunction without grounding it. We're not talking about someone just being a bit lazy or disliking chores.
Well, not at all.
We're talking about the brain's command center struggling to sequence the steps required to clean a room, combined with a reward center that is literally starving for stimulation. A pile of laundry simply doesn't provide enough dopamine for the brain to initiate the task of folding it. That's the actual mechanism.
Exactly. The mechanism is invisible and highly complex. But a messy room, a chaotic desk, that is highly visible. It is tangible. It becomes a digestible behavioral proxy for a complex internal state.
It's a shortcut.
Society latches onto the messy room because it's easy to see and easy to judge. It says, that is what the condition looks like. It transforms a struggle with task initiation into a visual aesthetic of chaos. And once that stereotype is set, it becomes rigid. The cultural narrative tells us that the diagnosis comes with a mandatory disorganized life.
It's so wildly reductive. We take a sliver of the reality, the fact that executive dysfunction can sometimes manifest as physical disorganization, and we blow it up until it eclipses the actual human being.
We let the symptom define the person.
Right, it sets up this incredibly rigid standard where the label dictates the behavior. If you were diagnosed with this, you must exhibit this specific flaw, you must be messy, which sets up the absolute brilliant contrast of Tomomi's actual lived experience.
Yes, and this is where she begins to completely dismantle the monolithic view of the disorder. She addresses the messy room stereotype head-on and states explicitly in her article, "I am not good at it, but I can do it."
I love that line.
It's so powerful. She acknowledges that tidying up and organizing might not be her innate, effortless strength, but she functions. She states that she manages daily chores with almost no difficulty. She can tidy up, she can organize, and crucially, returning to the very title of her piece, she can read the room.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the nuance in her phrasing, "I am not good at it, but I can do it," is the key to understanding high-level masking and adaptation. Think about how much of adult life is built on that exact premise. We all have things we aren't naturally good at.
Absolutely.
I'm not naturally good at complex mental math, but if I sit down and focus, I can calculate a tip or balance a budget. There is a canyon-sized difference between not being naturally good at something and being completely unable to do it. The societal stereotype demands that people with her diagnosis are fundamentally unable to organize. Tomomi is saying, no, it just requires a different kind of effort.
It speaks to the concept of cognitive load. For a neurotypical person, tidying a room might have a cognitive load of 2 out of 10. It's mostly automatic.
You just do it without thinking.
Right. But for Tomomi, it might have a cognitive load of 7 out of 10. It requires conscious effort, perhaps specific systems she's built over 50 years, and deliberate focus. But, and this is the crucial part, she still does it.
She gets it done.
She manages it with almost no difficulty in terms of outward execution. The stereotype robs the individual of this agency and adaptation. It assumes the clinical label is a life sentence of incompetence. By demonstrating her functional capability, she highlights the paradox of competence, possessing a label that implies functional deficit while living a life that demonstrates functional capability.
But wait, if she can do it with almost no difficulty, again, playing devil's advocate here, doesn't that validate the people who say, see, if you just try hard enough, you can overcome it? If Tomomi can tidy up, why can't everyone with the diagnosis tidy up?
Because that assumes everyone's baseline traits and masking capabilities are identical, which completely ignores the reality of neurodiversity.
Everyone is starting from a different baseline.
Exactly. Tomomi's ability to tidy up doesn't mean the struggle isn't real for others. It means her specific manifestation of the condition, combined with her specific 50 years of lived experience, resulted in this particular capability. And we see this even more profoundly with her second point, the ability to read the room.
Oh, absolutely. Let's really dig into reading the room, because in the context of her article, which originates in a Japanese cultural context, reading the room, kuki wo yomu, isn't just about noticing if people are happy or sad.
No, it's a fundamental social requirement.
It is an incredibly complex, highly nuanced social skill. It requires intense social awareness, the continuous monitoring of group harmony, picking up on microexpressions, unspoken tensions, and subtle shifts in power dynamics. You have to be hyper-aware of your environment and every single person in it, anticipating their needs before they even speak.
And if we look at that through the clinical lens, it is the exact opposite of the impulsive, inattentive stereotype.
It really is.
The clinical assumption of inattention suggests an individual who is oblivious to their surroundings, someone who misses social cues or drifts off during conversations. Impulsivity suggests someone who blurts things out, disrupting group harmony without considering the social context.
The classic bull in a china shop idea.
Yes, yet here is a woman with this specific diagnosis who possesses the incredibly high-level executive functioning required to continuously monitor and flawlessly adapt to the emotional atmosphere of a room. This doesn't just challenge the clinical stereotype, it shatters it.
It does.
It forces us to ask a fundamental question. How can a brain labeled as inattentive be so acutely, almost surgically attentive to social dynamics.
Right, it completely flips the script. It almost sounds like a superpower born out of necessity. If you grow up with a brain that processes information differently and you are constantly receiving subtle societal feedback that you are doing things wrong, you might develop an incredible hyper-focus on social cues just to survive.
A trauma response, in a way.
Yeah, you overcompensate. To a clinical observer looking at a checklist, attention might mean staring at a spreadsheet for an hour. But to Tomomi, attention means processing the emotional state of 5 different people in a meeting simultaneously to ensure she doesn't step out of line.
That is a profound reframing of what attention actually means. It suggests that her attention isn't deficient. It is simply allocated differently, perhaps governed by an intense anxiety to fit in or a heightened sensitivity to her environment. It requires immense cognitive energy to read a room that way.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. And this brings us directly back to you, the listener. Consider your own daily life and the tasks you perform. How many complex social or logistical tasks do you execute every single day seamlessly, even if they drain you entirely? We all have a baseline of competence that operates independently of our innate neurological preferences.
We do things we hate all the time just because they have to be done.
Exactly. So why do we culturally assume that a clinical diagnosis instantly erases that baseline of competence? By asking ourselves this, we move past the medical label and begin to see the human being operating beneath it.
It's all about realizing that the label is just a starting point, not the whole story. And that perfectly transitions us to the absolute core insight of this entire deep dive. The central thesis of her article, which she puts right there in the title, the realization of the diversity of traits.
That phrase is so important.
After getting this diagnosis in her 50s, after reconciling the fact that she can perfectly tidy her physical space, after acknowledging her intense ability to read the room, her big takeaway wasn't to reject the doctor or the diagnosis. Her takeaway was realizing just how incredibly diverse and often invisible the traits of this condition actually are.
The phrase diversity of traits is incredibly precise. What she is articulating here is the true reality of a spectrum condition. When society hears spectrum, they often visualize a linear slider going from mild on one end to severe on the other.
Like a volume knob.
Right. But that is fundamentally incorrect. A true spectrum, a true diversity of traits, means that the condition is more like a soundboard with dozens of different dials. Executive function, sensory processing, working memory, emotional regulation.
Right, and they are all set independently.
For every single individual, those dials are set to completely different levels. The diagnosis is not a rubber stamp. It does not produce identical challenges, identical behaviors, or identical personalities in every person who receives it.
I love that soundboard analogy. It completely destroys the cookie-cutter expectation. The diagnosis is just a framework. It's a way of understanding certain underlying mechanics of how a brain processes dopamine and handles executive function, but it does not dictate how those mechanics are going to play out in the physical world.
Because context matters.
Exactly. Your personality, your cultural upbringing, your gender, your coping skills, your 50 years of life experience, all of that interacts with the neurological baseline. Just because Tomomi has the label doesn't mean she loses her individuality or her specific competencies like doing the laundry or intuitive understanding that her colleague is upset.
What's fascinating here is that the author's ultimate aha moment wasn't the diagnosis itself. The diagnosis was just the catalyst. The true revelation was discovering how wonderfully varied and non-stereotypical her own neurological traits could be.
It was a moment of self-discovery, really.
She thought she knew what the condition was. She believed the cultural narrative of the messy room and the inability to focus. But by looking at her own life, her tidy space, her sharp social awareness, she was forced to expand the definition.
To make room for herself within it.
Yes. She realized that her specific manifestation of a condition might be entirely invisible to the outside world, but it is still entirely valid. This is a vital contribution to our understanding of neurodiversity. The concept that neurological differences are a natural part of human variation, not inherently defective models that all look the same and need to be cured or hidden.
She took this rigid, suffocating box that society and clinical history handed her, and she just pushed the walls out until it fit the reality of her actual life. It's incredibly empowering. But there is a twist in our source material.
Oh yes, the ending.
We absolutely have to give it the time it deserves because it is simultaneously hilarious and incredibly thought-provoking in terms of how it illustrates everything we've just discussed.
Yes, the abrupt ending of the excerpt.
It's literally a cliffhanger. The text we are analyzing, this profound reflection on late-in-life diagnosis, defying stereotypes, and the diversity of traits, attempts to address one final clinical symptom. The author writes that people with this diagnosis are said to be easily distracted, and then the text reads, "but, for example," and it just ends.
It cuts off completely.
The excerpt completely cuts off right there. You cannot write better irony than an article about being easily distracted ending on a literal distraction, an unfinished thought.
The irony is palpable, certainly,
Mhm.
but rather than dismissing it as a formatting error or being frustrated by the missing text, we can use this abrupt ending as an analytical tool.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Let's extrapolate strictly based on the themes she has already established in the preceding paragraphs. We know her methodology. She introduces a stereotype, and then she dismantles it with her lived reality. She proves she can maintain a tidy physical environment, defying the assumption of external chaos. She proves she can read the room, defying the assumption of social obliviousness. So, following this established pattern, what might her unique version of being distracted actually look like?
Okay, let's really think about this. If her distraction doesn't look like the stereotype, if she isn't the person looking out the window while you're talking to her, or losing her keys every 5 minutes, or leaving a trail of physical chaos behind her, what is it?
Based on her high functionality.
Right. If she is highly functional, executing daily chores without difficulty, and deeply, intensely attuned to the emotional states of the people around her, where does the distraction live? My instinct is that the distraction is entirely internal.
That is a highly logical and clinically sound extrapolation. For someone who masks well and functions at a high level outwardly, the chaos doesn't disappear. It simply moves from the external environment to the internal environment.
It just goes underground.
Her physical room might be perfectly tidy. Her social interactions might be flawless. But her mental room, that might be filled with racing thoughts, a dozen simultaneous trains of thought, a constant internal monologue critiquing her social performance, or an exhausting hypervigilance.
It's the classic duck analogy, right? Above the water, the duck is gliding smoothly, looking completely serene and in control. But underwater, those little feet are paddling frantically just to keep moving forward. Her external presentation is the serene duck. Her internal reality is the frantic paddling.
Exactly. And to a clinical observer, or to a friend or colleague, she doesn't look distracted. Because our definition of distraction requires a visual cue, looking away, fidgeting, forgetting a task.
We want to see the distraction.
But her distraction might look like focusing on too many things at once internally, while maintaining a perfect, socially acceptable facade externally. She might be sitting in a meeting, perfectly reading the room, nodding at the right times, while internally her brain is processing the hum of the air conditioner, analyzing a conversation from 3 days ago, and mapping out the logistical steps for tidying her house later that evening.
Wow.
The cognitive load is immense, and the distraction is absolute, but it is invisible.
And that right there is the ultimate testament to the diversity of traits. Her distraction doesn't look like the traditional stereotype because her distraction has been trained over 50 years to hide itself. It's customized to her. It's uniquely hers. The cliffhanger ending of the article is actually the perfect metaphor for her internal state. A thought interrupted, a pivot in attention that the outside world never gets to see the end of.
It really is fitting.
Which brings up a massive question for you, the listener. What does this all mean for how you interact with the world? When you encounter a cliffhanger in someone else's personality, when someone doesn't quite make sense to you, or they don't neatly fit the label or the assumption you've assigned to them, how do you react?
It requires a fundamental paradigm shift in how we evaluate information and how we evaluate each other. We are socially trained to look for surface-level markers. We want the easy answer, the quick diagnostic shortcut.
We just want to put them in the box.
But Tomomi's story demands that we look deeper. It demands that we acknowledge the sheer complexity and the internal friction of the human experience. When we rely on cliches and behavioral caricatures, we erase the individual. We erase their effort, their masking, their 50 years of adaptation. But when we actively embrace the diversity of traits, we allow people to be fully, authentically themselves, contradictions and all.
It is such a powerful takeaway, and it completely changes the lens through which we view neurodiversity. We have covered incredible ground today. We started with the sheer existential weight of Tomomi Hirata's diagnosis in her 50s, unpacking what it means to rewrite an entire lifetime of invisible
A
struggles.
lot to process.
We broke down the rigid, reductive stereotypes of the three core clinical symptoms, looking at how society twists medical terms into moral failings. We marveled at the paradox of competence, her perfectly tidy life, and her sharp, highly attuned room reading abilities, proving that a label does not erase your baseline capability or your agency. And ultimately, we uncovered the beautiful, complex reality of the diversity of traits, using a literal cliffhanger to understand the exhausting, invisible depth of internal masking.
We've seen how someone can carry a label that culturally implies chaos, yet live a life where they effortlessly tidy up and expertly read the room. It forces a profound reevaluation of our daily interactions. It makes you wonder, if traits are truly this diverse, this heavily masked, and this invisible, how many people in your own daily life, perhaps a colleague, a family member, or even the person sitting next to you right now, are quietly, exhaustingly defying the label society has placed on them? And more importantly, as you navigate your own life and your own internal friction, what unseen diversity of traits might you be carrying yourself?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning those labels, keep looking for the hidden nuance beneath the surface, and we will catch you next time.